Welcome everyone to YouTube Masterclass. This is a Coursera class that you can get units for USC, Calarts, and or Harvard. You'd have to split up the units for all three, but there's 4 units per semester class taught. That this is the 4th semester we've taught, counting summer, spring, and fall of last year, this being fall of this year. And we're going to teach a class in spring, starting late December, early January, and it will be a class on the directing of Quentin Tarantino and his auteur style. We're just studying auteurs this year, and then next summer we'll start with the genre classes of the Western, and we'll do sci-fi and musical the years later. And it's going to be a long way through this masterclass process. There's a lot of film criticism in this whole conjuncture of everything we have to look at when it comes to the books and movies and music of these master classes. That they're film courses is surprising, because there's not a film school at Harvard necessarily, but that we're trying to teach for a long number of years so that there can come about methods of even getting a film minor is what we're working for now. Someday a film major at Harvard. And you can also take it for your other classes that you might need to fill up. In colleges that grant you to take this course through Coursera, it isn't close to those schools, but I will say I can't assign units necessarily to anyone except who took this course for those classes. Other colleges will have to give you permission for a written suggestion that they get for their electives credit for this course. And I don't know how Coursera does that, except I know that it appeals to other schools for credit on every class, and sometimes gets places that you can take the class for an elective formidably, you know what I mean, take a lecture. And that we've got this lecture today. It's pretty much the wrap up. We've got 2 more classes left. They're going for an hour long, and they're about this tour style of D.W.Griffith. And there will be a few classes between the meeting of the 2 semesters this year and next year. Between that in the winter break, at the beginning of the winter break, we'll have 6 more classes, and they'll be about all the different things we've been talking about, and kind of some of what I'm touching today at this very intro is how we do this masterclass. And then there'll be a section on myself, which I have duty now to introduce myself in these other master classes, as I have enough work as a compatriot to this program to then realize, hey, we've got master classes in the semester when we're missing in the semester, to bolster up the career of myself, and then all the projects I seem to have done and want to do more of. And then we can talk a little bit about that, because my career is my credentials for my master class, which is mainly from the PhD I received at California Institute of the Arts, which had to be commuted from other PhDs too. It was a very difficult triumph experience, where we get into places we need to get into so we can get the message across about the cinema, so we can get the message across about the literature and aesthetics and philosophy and all the things we love to study. That I do have a PhD at Harvard in aesthetics and philosophy. You can look up on the internet, and I see there's a number of you that already knew that. That Calarts, I have a PhD at USC. I have a Master's of Fine Arts in Production, which you pretty much have to have a lot of requirements. Like, you pretty much have to have a box office blowout a couple of times to even be in the master section of USC. Like, USC has to generate so much time and care and time and space into the things I do, that all of these schools that I've gone to are now promoting me and are the sponsors of these whole projects. That no one really liked at first the idea of a D.W.Griffith classes, because he always seems like the antagonist, and even by the time we get to this class, he seems kind of like an intentional antagonist. But in Thomas Edison discussions, we see that Griffith is quite the anomaly and breaks free from the Thomas Edison decision-making of early cinema in America, which was trying to amp up that it would soon be as good as the French cinema, which began in 1895, December 12th, and was when a train arriving in a station came out in France, and that now in America, D.W.Griffith gets in a film as a stuntman in the Thomas Edison / Breakaway to Hollywood, and he does a stunt double where it looks like he's riding on a bird and an eagle, and he gets down on the eagle's nest. And it's really interesting that that's the first film that he shows up in, because he did actually intern and try out in every different part of the film knowledge, but especially as an actor, because he was a stage actor when he first started out, and he'd actually run across the play that would be the one they'd use for Birth of a Nation, The Klansman, in the theater realm, and he would make that into The Birth of a Nation years later when it came time to him command a giant set of giant actors and 5,000 horses, you know. And Intolerance actually has the most horses of any movie, I think, at 6,000. I know that the horses in some other movies, there's other movies that I'd just gone over, and I was so confident that I'd get the silent film in which it was made, but there's other horse movies that have all kinds of horses, and War Horse, and we talked about that. We talked about the one from the silent era, I always forget the name of, and then The Birth of a Nation and Intolerance, though combined, which you really can combine them in some weird ways as the ultimate project together, because it would be Griffith's only medium to look at through the eye of the lens of Griffith, was that you were in the middle of Intolerance and in the middle of... Yeah, I'm on live. Okay, well, sorry about that, class. There was a little quick turntable of time that we had to take, and that's okay because someone knocked on the door and I'm not really sure what they needed, but I was going to check it anyway. So to get back into it, to look through the eye of a Griffith lens, you've got to see it as a Birth of a Nation experience as well as an Intolerance experience, as well as they're both honed in on the same thing. And I apologize for answering the door because it threw us a little bit off. But Griffith's mindset from the time he spent at vaudeville as an actor and the time he spent in New York as an understudy of Edison's and an understudy of Porter, Edwin S. Porter being the one who showed D.W.Griffith how to direct and how to edit. And a lot of this was posed into the mind of how to direct and how to edit. And so then you look into the channel of, then these movies come about in the silent era that are all short films. And this is already 1909. And in precursor to 1909 to 1895, when it all started, there were a lot of really fast short films that were only 1 minute to 2 minutes to eventually 5 minutes. And then Story of Kelly Gang comes along in Australia and makes the first feature film, which feature means on Wikipedia 40 minutes and above. So if it's 40 minutes and above, that means it's 2 reels to be 40 or 3 reels to be 60 minutes, and it's 20 minutes a reel. And 60 minutes is definitely a full-length feature. Actually, a 40-minute film is a full-length feature, and a 30-minute film is a short film. And the reason they had that cutoff moment is because there were films of every shape and size, especially in the sound era. And then later, when they went back to archive those films, they had to set the standard to 40 minutes because that's where most of the longer reeled movies were. And to restore a longer reeled movie, going up to like however many reels they had of Greed compared to how many reels they took out, compared to the pictures being on digital video after that to be put back into Greed, the reels that originally had were the most of any Hollywood film up to that time. With The Birth of a Nation gave birth to Erich von Stroheim, as well as other directors, Joseph von Sternberg, and Roald Walsh and John Ford and all. John Ford was really the one to come out of Griffith's cinema cult into creating his own film cult. By the time he had made Straight Shooting, he'd already worked for Birth of a Nation with D.W. Griffith. John Ford's movies have a lot of horses in them. The Cavalry trilogy that we'll look at sometime. The Cavalry trilogy, in the Western class, we'll talk about it. And it's Fort Apache, Rio Grande, and Fort Apache, Rio Grande, and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. And She Wore a Yellow Ribbon is the second one, and it's all in color. And Rio Grande is like the last one, and Fort Apache is the first one. And Fort Apache, unfortunately, is one of those films that picks the wrong side of the politics. On the one hand, it interjects that the Native Americans were able to communicate and manage their own labor, but on the other hand, the Native Americans are suppressed somewhat into the format of what the stereotypes that they look and act like is still in Fort Apache, especially because Custer's is kind of ambiguous because of the editing and studio work as maybe a hero, not a villain. And I find that the not a villain approach to Custer is a bad move, because ever since Little Big Man, enough of the history had been pulled back up to know that Custer was to blame, that he was going to just sacrifice these Indians because they were Indians, Native Americans, and that Custer didn't win the final battle of his career is because the Native Americans had already figured out how to beat him, and they suckered him into going down into a valley. They surrounded him when he went down into it, you know, and killed him. So in Fort Apache, all this happens, and you're seeing this amount of like Native Americans working in to be like this positive glance on the Native Americans, that they're working to be the winners of this war. And whether it's for America or not, really, or really for the Native Americans, they're winning this war all of a sudden. So they already have progress in them, but now we take and think that might have been an American hero, Custer. We don't want to say that, like, he's not a hero in the film, because the film is about legendaries. And the other two films, that's the first film of the Cavalry trilogy, and it's cavalry because it's always in a fort where there's Indians and Native Americans and cowboys and the U.S. military. And I've just got to say, the U.S. military deserves a lot of respect for movies in general, even since Hearts of the World and about World War I by Griffith, or before. The military is really the counteracting force that even gets to go through and let movies even be made. Not that they go fight for foreign countries to let us use foreign countries as the backdrop to our movies. That's not really what the American military is for. But when going to foreign places or a dangerous situation, or for a documentary or a foreign country, the filming would go with the military, because the military works for the government of the U.S., and the government of the U.S. would have to get involved if there was travel to another country. But they get pretty cut loose in some countries to follow even the rules and genres of the foreign countries. And so you can see that, like, there's a certain government impact in how we make films, and that came from Edison and even Griffith. But really, before they went to foreign lands, they would import movies from other countries, and that's how really the whole factor got into play about a full-length movie, because Cabiria and an earlier Italian film, Inferno, and other Italian sword and sandal epics had come out right up against D.W.Griffith finally shifting over to the movie industry and directing Judith of Bethulia, and then that being still kind of a short film, or almost long enough. There's different versions. And then finally he did his first feature film, which is The Avenging Conscience, which is about an hour and 90 minutes and already in feature form. But he had to see where Cabiria was going with its 4 hours, and so then he locked on and made The Birth of a Nation. And then the real controversy begins, that all of his earlier films weren't exactly safe in the sense that they were untouched by vaudeville, but that his other films were already the essential films to see in that era of the silent era, that they were really popular, was how he rose to directing greats. And John Ford would rise right next to him. A few years later, his career would start out with a film called Straight Shooting, and he'd have other westerns on his career. But when he gets to The Iron Horse, he takes a long break after The Iron Horse and goes all the way to Stagecoach in 1939, which he hadn't directed yet. And when he does direct Stagecoach, he does it so he can have the full Western effect, but now with sound, even though there's already a lot of B movies that are sound movies of Westerns. This next Stagecoach is going to be the A-list movie, and by that era, D.W.Griffith's gone. So it's kind of ironic how John Ford lasts through the times, lasts through World War II, and is directing the entire time and never loses his scope as director, and kind of always has the military working with him, even when there's big productions. And I think that Griffith was the one that had military work with him in a lot of his productions, so in case anything went wrong, in case anyone was, any conflicts had occurred, in case there was something had gone wrong with conflict in another land, later in the film business in America. But because the American military has such a good military, that's probably the reason why the films of the United States are so successful, because they do. It's not like engineering a colonial way to get other foreign country cinema. It's more like import-export. We'll come there, you come here, and we'll all make movies. Isn't exactly the case, but it's more like, if we go there and something breaks out, we're going to declare ourselves against whatever breaks out against us. And that's not really what it is either. It's more like, they're going to go set up a campground that may be really technical to set up for the filmmakers in a foreign country, or set up an architectural engineering call by the military, and somehow all you've got, like in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the architectural engineering of that kind of a movie is like already setting up this massive architecture that has to be engineered so that it looks the same inside as it looks out in space, and these big spaceships that are having this sort of waltz of the Blue Danube, of also the spaceships, where the spaceships are traveling around in outer space. You had to have the military at least looking over the idea of how space is traveled to in 2001: A Space Odyssey, that our technology is a lot farther along than even the news lets on to know. When they know more, and so does the space program, which knows more, but you can't really introduce to everyone that there's really a space program that can do the things that they show in 2001. If a military had been that strong that they'd show what they could do in 2001, then that's how they got the machines to look like they do now, that were past 2001, and it still seems like there's technology in that film that's above what we have now. But we know that that was what they all had in 1968, because that's when 2001: A Space Odyssey comes out. And now we know we have all that, and it was prophetic in its sensibility in outer space, because the U.S. military gave it a few secrets, because they wanted to see a cool movie about outer space too. And so we kind of have to thank like these big productions with the U.S. military, and that's why these movies like Birth of a Nation, even Judith Bethulia, where they had a military in Hollywood, wasn't like a police state. It was just to make sure that nothing goes wrong on the set. No one's ever been kidnapped from a Hollywood set necessarily. I'd be a good movie, Kidnapped from a Hollywood set, And all these things we talk about with D.W.Griffith come out when he starts making more movies after Birth of a Nation, when even that movie's been banned from its full release, which could have lasted years in 1915, and did, until finally the box office said no. The NAACP said no screenings of this anywhere because of the painted face, the painted blackface color, blackface, was too offensive to the NAACP, and that the African Americans banned the film, saying it was too offensive towards their race, and that race being an issue in this film only because it's about slavery. And at the time the film was made, they didn't know that slavery was really a racist issue, although they had feelings that it was, and they were trying to seemingly show that kind of representation in Birth of a Nation is kind of assaulting to the modern day viewer who wants a clearer and more realistic perspective of the Civil War, which really a clear Civil War representation is Birth of a Nation. Like all of its representation in the first hour and a half, hour 40 minutes of the Civil War is probably by the book how most of it happened. I mean, they didn't list all the soldiers that were at the fight, but I mean, these big battles that we're taking out in Birth of a Nation are actually as clear and close as you're going to get to the Civil War, until actually the slavery thing breaks apart. Because when slavery is illegalized in the South and Atlanta is burned and the whole place goes up in smoke in the South, like it does in Gone with the Wind and a few others, the South is left in a state of chaos and eruption, to which the Klansmen deem necessary excuse me, to take leadership and they decide to fight back against the riots and confusion because of what's happened now that the slaves are set free. They don't know where to go. And actually, in reality, a lot of them went to the North. We see in history books where it was legal to be an African American, and there were factories and industry there that were sweatshops, yes. And did they have a black population? I'm sure they did in the North. In the North, they say they didn't discriminate, but I'm sure that because of the discrimination of the South and Northerners moving to the South, the Southerners moving to the North, or running to the North, even as white people would run to the North, you know, especially if they weren't as racist, but it would still seem that because they came from the South to the North, sometimes as a choice where that would be where they'd want to be for the Civil War, meant that they were kind of siding with the blacks, but they were already deeply rooted in Deep South racism. So I'm sure it was alertive in the cities of the North as something that was against the rules. And since it wasn't necessarily Thomas Edison or D.W.Griffith that wanted to resort to reversing any rules of the racial environment of 1915, but that Griffith actually, one of the reasons he left Edison was to make Birth of a Nation, because he had seen that play. The Klansmen had been so initiated to want to make a film like based on the Klansmen that he just went full headlong into it and began to make this big construction. And the bigger the construction, the closer he was getting to the Italian Sandal and Sword epics that were predating Birth and were building these big monuments to sets and actors and things to make look real about the long ago past, and caught up to present in the terms of the movie business. The cinema was to encapsulate the series of Sword and Sandal epics all the way up to Intolerance, where Griffith makes The Fall of Babylon, and it completely begins to come around in full circle that with The Fall of Babylon approaching in the Intolerance section, we're now going to have a 3-hour-and-a-half movie, Intolerance. And there's a lot of versions of that too. See, the versions go through from the film stock, edited from copied from a master print onto the print that shows in a projector. And that you strike a few negatives to be, and then the master too means that there's already different versions of the film that you could also put in the projector, even striking negatives from to build the master print from the negative, you see. And that's why there's this whole thing about lots of versions of films. And I know that's a sticky subject for some of us, because we want to say, as film observers, how can we know it's the film we're studying? And so we stay off of that topic, because there's no point in really saying, well, I saw the 60s version or I saw the 2008 version, unless you really go in-depth studying of the film. They haven't been changed enough to where the content creation for the film was altered with enough to the scope of the film being changed in its medium and its artistic desire and its aesthetic course to set its own personal precedences about the ways that movies are made. And that there's always a military working with a military war film is true too. And that mainly started with Birth of a Nation, and but you can see in Fort Apache how that kind of passed on to John Ford. That whole colonial Western civilization grows bigger than everything and kind of takes over the world. So after Birth of a Nation, you have Intolerance, and that's 4 films in one. It's the Fall of Babylon with the St. Valentine's Day early war, and it has the Jesus story, sort of, and it has this, not that I'm complaining, and it has the execution of a modern man when his wife can't afford to have him around. He can't afford to have her around. Their new baby has to be taken away because they all can't afford to have a baby in their home when they're not making enough money. So he's going to be executed. And then it's the last film to show up on the 4 lists of film, which are all edited randomly together. But it's always a jump cut from issue to issue. It's a jump cut from film to film. But it's a regular editing that edits it together. The jump cut from Babylon to French to Jesus to the modern day story, which has a last-minute rescue. That Griffith loves last-minute rescues, is totally involved. But between those 4 films is a jump cut, and there's also intertitles, and the intertitles really set up the next event that's going to happen. I mean, it's almost like it's beyond Godardian, where the intertitles are now the chapters of the film. You know, and they do that in a lot of silent films, where the intertitles will show what chapter of the film we're on. And it's like, well, if we get to whatever chapter of the DVD, that may not be along with the chapters which are listed and what they're called and how that's going to affect the narrative meaning. Because a chapter with a narrative meaning, even in an intertitle, stops where you're at and takes you to somewhere else to where you're at, if that's the kind of film this is. That these films had nothing in common with each other really at all, except maybe they were about the overthrow of slavery, which they were almost about, but really they were from slavery to destruction is another way to look at these intolerance films, and we kind of read meaning, because Griffith's trying to make another set the slaves free type movie, but he doesn't know that he's done that with Birth of a Nation, which may have other venues and may have other supports than the racist version and the unracist version. You've got to think, where have we spliced it from there? And if the movie was re-edited by the time it was re-released in the 80s, which was the next great re-release, after the 70s kind of died down on why they had to take that out of circulation for a while until VHS came out more in the, you know, as the digital world is starting to encumber, so is Birth of a Nation finally resurfacing in the home video market. But it's a very rare title because it is silent, and you got to realize that because you're in this class, we're talking a lot about the silent era, and it's important to know that the shape of the silent era was all Hollywood classical cinema, basically, or a primitive mode of representation to become a standard mode of representation, like by the time of Birth of a Nation, Intolerance. And Intolerance isn't even a mode of representation that isn't a modern representation with all the jump cuts, even though they're intertitle chaptered over between the switchbacks of the narrative, which kind of skip different ones. But we say all that to say that the modern day death of this couple is avoided by the last minute rescue. They take him off the death penalty at the last minute, and so the family may become an American family and live together and grow together, and that everyone's fine with that all of a sudden, which I never really see how it resolves the factor that they need a job or something, because it seems like they're going to need a job, and that they don't really say how they're going to raise the kid anyway. At least they won't be executed for not being able to do it, and be framed and all that for a murder, and framed and all that for going against the government. And so now the government's already said, we approved this film, and this guy going against the government of the era it was reflecting was kind of ironic, because it was the era that the film was made in, that the modern film version was supposed to be mirroring. And Griffith, of that 1916 element of having part of the movie be where we're really at in time, is already kind of questioning how we see birth as being of that time, because we didn't live in a time where we were arrested for not being able to pay for our children, although a lot are driven to the streets when not able to pay the debt to society's owed. And that can be a whole topic of like these beggars of life type movies that come out of the poor sensibility that Griffith's trying to reflect in Birth of a Nation, that there is a big enough audience now, with the audience reception changing from before to looking in these machines and seeing like these Nickelodeons, or seeing like these films play in Nickelodeons. They throw a nickel in and the film plays. You know, it's these short 1 minute, 2 minute movies, and then you get to vaudeville, Tin Pan Alley and all that, where recording all these records and you're recording all these movies, and boom, they explode, some of them after they're done, because they don't need the Tin Pan Alley film anymore. It's a 2 minute, 3 minute, or it's a vaudeville film. Vaudeville films are filler for about 5 to 10 minutes of different movies that are a minute long. And Griffith already at that circuit, but he's going as an actor, so now he is still an actor going into cinema, and then he starts interning with Porter and looking at Porter and seeing how that Griffith needs to leave and establish Hollywood in the West, in LA, because establishing Hollywood is a way better idea than staying to work for Edison, who is a master of many things, golden about inventing in electronics, but was not the inventor of cinema necessarily. That Edison had built some things that were similar to the cinema that was first released in France is actually strange, because some of his optical devices came out before that, but they never really turned into cinema because it wasn't production, distribution, exhibition, which all films need, which distribution is where the film company puts it out there, and the exhibition turns it on and plays it, like the theaters is the exhibition. And so already Griffith is seeing how he could build a theater out of these, build a big theater, and then they'd have a big audience in there at once to show that many people the screening of a movie, because that many people, and then the next audience screening of it would be the ones to kind of watch these movies as kind of a, you know, like ride, like a like an experimental roller coaster ride. But that they didn't really always jump up and jump down, and that the military was helpful on even the Judith of Bethulia Hollywood movies. The government was kind of kept out of the contract to early Hollywood on to later Hollywood, because they didn't need to control them. And then the irony of ironies, Birth of a Nation's trying to be under no control, is going into this sacred ground of being a film that all people want to see in the giant theaters that he's imposing, that movie palaces be built so that everyone can see this movie. And in America, that was unheard of, because there was only a few venues to actually see even films. And that's why Birth of a Nation is considered the first Hollywood film, because they built these theaters bigger than the ones that the small venues that had played Judith of Bethulia had shown. Griffith was thinking if it was shown in movie palaces and movie theaters all over the world, and that they'd build them just in America as much as they could, made by the studios, which owned the production, distribution, and exhibition of a vertical integrated studio system, mainly because of Birth of a Nation, because it showed in every theater that it possibly could, and everyone that had heard about it thought it sounded like an oddity that they'd never get to see again in film history, and boy, were they right. I can't think of one other movie except a few exploitation films that even have representations of Klansmen as being on the right side of the narrative. And today that seems comical to say, well, yeah, of course the Klansmen were on the right side of the narrative in 1915, but even this is so far from the Civil War, which does say that it had Klansmen at the aftermath clean up the South and make the South a bigger company, and the Southern image of the Confederacy and its Civil War happening and winning in the South was common after Birth of a Nation, and really was a lead up from working at Biograph, where Biograph Griffith had The Proud Kentuckian and A Slave in His Trust on his short films list, which Proud Kentuckian is the guy was going to join the Klan and gets killed. And then you have, like, you know, A Slave in His Trust, which is the African-American guy, still in blackface here, but saves the little girl from the house and gives her back to the white family, the white little girl, and thus he's gone back into the burning house, saved her, and brought her out. And they couldn't do that, but their slave went and got it. And so these are all stories that we think are showing us leading up to, well, we all know the North won, right, in today's standard, because they were the ones that cast the surrender onto the South. And that a surrender isn't really a loss. It's more like a, let's put an end to the war type thing. That there were more troops in the North, yes, that's how they won, is by having more troops alive than the almost extinguished troops of the Civil War of the South. Makes sense that the Klansmen rose as these kind of fascist avengers of society, because that's how the war was won, was by power and control. And so these offshoot of secret organizations rise, even as we're speaking, even as the Birth of a Nation was made, for vigilante justice underground, that they have the muscle and Minutemen to prepare for these writings is not just a truth that we've all dealt with since then. It's probably because of the destruction of the South that they really did have to fully arise in society and take on this kind of vigilante leadership, which really only comes in handy when you're in trouble or something bad's about to happen, because then you can say, well, man, if like some Klansmen were here, they'd intimidate everybody. I'm not talking about race, though, because so you always wonder, why are there not many African Americans where there's the race card isn't being pulled and it's mostly all white people. It's not just that there's a Klan structure there. A lot of the Klan could be there. You're like, but I thought they were chasing down everyone that wasn't of their race, you know. And really, if they're stocked in a non-racist, mostly white area, then yeah, there's a chance that anyone in the community could fall under, I need help, I just got attacked, you know, something bad happened to me, and so now the KKK is coming to help me, because they help out with situations where there's no harm involved of the person that's like in trouble. So they've done that since the days of Birth of a Nation, because in Birth of a Nation it wasn't like they were in trouble, but the South was about to fall apart, and they were about the only bastion of vigilante help to help out. Hang on, I'll be there in 20 minutes. And so the days gone by of the day when we were racist thinking with the Klan, you had to know that the Civil War wasn't exactly being represented in 1915 how it looks today in our society, now that we've had films like The Birth of a Nation, that new one that has the African-American actors as the African-American population in the film, and the blackface was typically what was rooted out as racist, as well as the metaphorical movements of the black character being stereotypical of what was going on vaudeville. So you think all of a sudden that these premises are dated, and then all these premises fell apart when you see that we think of the Civil War because of films like Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, and we think of the Civil War being like that because they're closer in history to when they happened. But the further in history means the further information you gain on it, and without even being politically correct, you can say that the North won the war, but then when you're talking about the Confederacy becomes not very politically correct, and I don't see really why, because actually after the Civil War, the North and South made up. Abraham Lincoln saw the North and South make up right before his assassinations. He saw the war heroes all claiming war heroship on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, which was abolished after the Civil War. So really, there were a lot of things left out, Birth of a Nation, that really could have shaped what really is the North and South of the Civil War. and how they banded together, and how they eliminated racism for the sense of they invited back the lower states and didn't allow slavery at all anymore. And not allowing slavery at all anymore is the way that eventual racism was eliminated, because slavery could not be done by the person that owned the plantation, and that's why they were getting so rich off the plantation life. And so D.W.Griffith kind of metaphoricalized the Industrial Revolution right before it happened was the Civil War, and even the Underground Train, the Underground Express that took Southern blacks to the North, was not shown in the version of Birth of a Nation that I've seen, or any of the versions of Birth of a Nations I've seen, and makes me wonder when they were transferring the film if they made another version. And hey, there may be other versions of a film, but once you found the canonized version, which is like the Library of Context, the Library of Congress version, or the Hollywood version that's made to look like what it is for what it is in terms of that production, none of those things are exactly determining which version you use, except theirs is the only true canonical version, the Hollywood version, or else the longer version released, or the other editions that are released onto home video. Home video being ascribing to things you can order off of the internet, and things you can order off the internet by Griffith are massive. There's a lot of DVDs and Blu-rays that you can get off of the internet from D.W. Griffith Foundation. So don't forget that, like, there are things that lead to other studies, like not race, class, and gender studies in cinema all begin at Birth of a Nation, really, or A Slave and His Trust and The Proud Kentuckian. And the slavery factor is all what determines, like, that they're being racist, right? Even though it doesn't seem like those are two different things. Racism and slavery are two different things. You probably could have had a slave owner that didn't even think that blacks were a lesser race, or they all had to think that because they were under the conspiracy of a group that at the time was even more sharp than the Klan and had this, like, social Darwinist attitude of we're the greatest of all. And that could be the Freemasons or something. Like, they could say still that they're the greatest of all people, that they have the most intelligence and the most, and like, but then they'd say, well, we do allow people of other races into our society. But the Klan happens to be an organization that doesn't elect other races into the society. And so now it's a condemned organization, even before Birth of a Nation comes in to show the movie about how the Klan came about during the Civil War in the South. So we've come all the way to the Birth of a Nation, and then we get to Intolerance, and now they've got these themes of the slaves being taken away. In Orphans of the Storm, we get this sense that the slave girls are lost on the streets and taken in secret by this kind of witch lady that is going to guide them to their doom, and that they have to do her bidding, and they have to rob banks to militate against, like, the state that the war will end. They have to totally throw themselves to the bonds of war and the bonds of captivity and the bonds of slavery, homelessness. So there's your beggars of life thing again, the homelessness of all these characters. And then we look at one of Griffith's closest friends and workers who found out a UA with him, Charlie Chaplin. And then we realize in all of Charlie Chaplin's movies, Charlie Chaplin is basically a homeless guy. That he always plays the tramp means that the tramp is one of those characters that's always homeless. And that the homeless guy, the tramp, must have gone a long way before he got back to where he was, because his clothes are torn, his shoes are ripped up, you know, and he's always portraying this lower class. And the lower class had come in the cinema to represent kind of this stereotype, not at all because of the tramp, because he stepped in and showed what it would be like to be, even though he's rich as an actor, even from the vaudeville, that now he's rich as an actor in cinema for playing a homeless man. And so you can see Hollywood already siding with the lower classes just in its superstar icon, Charlie Chaplin. And The Orphans of the Storm is definitely one of those Chaplin-type nature plays about these girls that are beyond poverty, being held captively, and one of them goes blind. Lillian Gish's sister, Dorothy Gish. Dorothy Gish goes blind, and not for real, but in the movie, her actor self goes blind. And we got to remember that the movies versus the reality is a different thing, but you remember the movie as a film buff more than the reality. You're saying, like, I remember the reality, and the reality of Europe was essential to remember, but it was like a movie. The reality in the movie was essential to remember, and that, like, Dorothy Gish going blind was acting, was artifice, was not meant for us to think that Dorothy Gish really went blind, and that she was playing a blind woman. It was like Gina Rowlands in A Woman Under the Influence, where they say that she scooted around the stage, she screamed around the stage, but during the non-acting parts, they were all laughing, the Cassavetes. During A Woman Under the Influence, they were laughing, playing along, and then they'd go into the notes of the improv of a really hard scene to film, and they'd be back into the screaming and lushing around of this whole family, wondering if the antidote of mental illness had been found yet, because their mother's going into an extreme behavior. And Gina Rowlands was not schizophrenic, but she plays a schizophrenic woman. And there's some argument to that, saying, well, if you see it in the movie, it must be real in reality, and it really isn't. I promise you. And I always say that in Taxi Driver, Harvey Keitel didn't really get killed. We'll talk more about this in the Tarantino class, but Harvey Keitel got killed again in Reservoir Dogs. So then you're like, well, one of them's not telling me the truth, because I thought, but cinema's, now we're saying cinema is a metaphorical truth, since you can only put over the things that are realistic from the script into a realistic reality of the film, unless you're recreating what already happened, which is more, again, something they did with the Italian neorealism, recreating events that already happened, as versus an artificial to events that are metaphorically real, that is kind of saying that they're fantasy, that if you're aboard a spaceship watching a movie thinking you're aboard a spaceship, that's probably fantasy, because you have to go into a real spaceship with a spacesuit to really go to another planet or outer space. You have to go in a spacesuit because you can't breathe the air. So now next time we go into an outer space movie, they should have like spacesuits for us to put on, so we can really feel like we're in the movie, you know, like we're really in space. And whenever we have the simulators, notice they don't have the spacesuits, so we're definitely in virtual reality modes of what outer space is like. So we had this long-winded lecture today about D.W.Griffith in the early days that we had all the other time, and it goes through and it talks about Hearts of the World, and it talks about Broken Blossoms, and it talks about After Intolerance, and then it talks about Sorrows of Satan in the 20s. It talks about, you know, the struggle in the 30s. There's ones all throughout the 20s of Griffith, Way Down East after Broken Blossoms, and The Orphans of the Storm after Way Down East. In America is another one that Griffith did still in the silent era of the struggle, and Abraham Lincoln being his sound films. And then after two versions of Battle of the Sexes in both areas, and The Avenging Conscience being revived as his first feature film, because by that time they had lengths, durations that were pretty much 40 minutes or more that were counted as feature films or feature programs. And so then Griffith goes on to shape together many more films after America that are big, and remakes of his whole idea, and remakes of his sudden ability of showmanship, and his ability to regenerate Birth of a Nation fell through ever. We talk about it so much because it's a pivotal film in multicultural intertextuality, even though it's on the wrong side of the argument. Even though it's on the wrong side of the argument, we can cull it to how we know what the right side of the argument is, just by watching it, just to say where our brains are with the characteristic of where we're supposed to be looking at an actual image of Birth of a Nation, evolved through all the cinema years to the one with Nat Turner today that was re-released, not re-released, but remade as a multicultural film, never making us remember necessarily that The Birth of a Nation in 1915, that early in the silent era, where the idea of small films, small minute-long films is just worn out, that The Birth of a Nation would be the settlement for all the justice in the cinema up to 1915, because it expanded the theatrical exhibition, is the main point of the lecture. And so next masterclass, I'm going to give the definition of the final and what we do for the final. And I'll give you some examples of what that'll be like and what it is prepared to look like. But I like that we've gone through the D.W.Griffith story. I like that you need to know that after the sound era, he went to World War II as a fighter pilot. Then when he came back, was in the asylum prison for being blacklisted for being a communist, because House Un-American activity had risen. And then the paramount dismantling of the vertical integration at the Supreme Court was a judgment called that they could no longer control the theaters, even though they built and paid for them and put them there. Now the theaters had to be controlled by an outside vendor. And those outside vendors were coming from other companies that weren't necessarily even film companies. They were just the ones paying the distributor to put it on, paying the distributor, and then having the distributor send the movie to the exhibition circuit. And really this wouldn't have worked very well if there hadn't have been like some kind of cause for why films had to go under one heading, always as being films, but not as the studio they were released by, being determined by the studio making it. And so the studio house style that even UA, as being this artistry filmmaking company all these years, that Chaplin, Griffith, Fairbanks, and Pickford all put together in 1919, the year of Broken Blossoms, the year of the Within Our Gates by Michaud, and that Griffith had produced, and he wasn't the only producer. They were looking for all kinds of producers at that time that were getting the films made, making sure the films get made, and the directors making the film. Because the producer, like Edison, could get the film made, but under his auspices that Griffith would program it or edit it the way he wanted it. And then Griffith, when he was further free at Biograph, he was like, well, I'm going to direct it the way I want to. And Biograph all leads up to a tradition of quality, which is this kind of narrative-based cinema that has kind of the family romance and the generic cues of match on action, which match on action is certainly not generic, except it can be made that way if it's all kind of a static picture of growth into itself. The war footage being recreated again of a war that went on long before that, but that's one of the best recreations we have of the Civil War's Birth of a Nation, because it's closest to the time of reflection, mirroring the actual time of the film. And then you go straight into kind of the modern era with Intolerance, and it's all off. And there's all these other films like that I haven't talked about that are in the filmography and everything that we would get into, and we would illustrate more points on the whole body of work, but really that we kind of look at the top 5 films as Birth of a Nation, Intolerance, Way Down East, and Orphans of the Storm, and of course in the middle of those is Broken Blossoms. And we had a whole class kind of dedicated to Broken Blossoms and what the meaning of Broken Blossoms was, and how this Japanese guy at this port that were like meticulously designed, and UA is kind of doing this melodrama, being their romantic melodrama, where the daughter of an Irish boxer falls in love with the Japanese guy, and the Irish boxer catches them both and tells them to break up or he'll kill them, and then comes back and breaks him up and kills him. And he didn't mean to kill his daughter. He was just going to beat her up, but like she died of her heartbreak. The Japanese and Lillian Gish playing the daughter of the Irishman, they embrace as they die, and it's this whole Romeo and Juliet ending at the end of D.W. Griffith's decade era. And then into the 20s, and in the 20s with Orphans of the Storm and Way Down East, you have Griffith going full steam ahead till we get to 1930, and he barely missed a beat all the way to Battle of the Sexes, and then Abraham Lincoln and the Struggle, which were ready to be wired for sound. He did lobby around for the jazz singer job, and that was one of the things he wanted to do. As a fighter pilot, he uncovered Dachau. He flew with Louis Armstrong. After the end of both World War I and World War II, he advocated for marijuana to be illegal for people that were in the military of the country. The military is the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines, and those are all members of the military. That most directors joined the Army and then moved into the Air Force and moved in. There probably will be some directors that are Marines, but they work only for the Army if they're Marines. And so those that came from the military on the Army side or the Air Force side were really the militaries that were concluded to be early progress of the cinema to join up with. However, the government was not really a factor on why the films were made. They were, except the irony of Birth of a Nation being made by the government. At the end of it all, Griffith turned his copy into the government, said they could reconstruct it, pretty much threw it to the fires of Thomas Edison, who didn't want to see that film at all and didn't really believe in any of it either way. Like, he was kind of a nihilist, kept to himself, had his own production, made a movie himself, Thomas Edison, in 1917, 1918, The Uninvited. It's a stale portrayal of a camp where everybody's army and military is being sent to die, and it's because they're injured or whatever other reason that the military is coming up with. The reasoning not being mentioned makes it seem existential, but that he's more of a nihilist because he's riding aimless around the camp telling these like female daughters of his who he needs taken out of or put in the camp. And it's a really strange movie, and I don't think they're really military bases where these guys are dying off and that's what's happening to them. I don't necessarily think that Thomas Edison really knew. If he knew how to write a story or what a story was about, it's not necessarily a reflection on what Griffith is saying Birth of a Nation is, a reflection of the thing, and that he never really minded either way that the Klansmen rose from this film, but he still supported the other governments of racial multiculturalism and egalitarianism and equality. And so it's all that he wanted to get his African-American Army friends, especially, who he was really friendly with, and who had changed him into one of producing an African-American movie. His Army friends were the ones that he was going to say, hey, I legalized marijuana for you. You know, I did it because you have PTSD from the war. Never really crossed our minds, except that he hung out in jazz clubs and bought him illegal marijuana anyway for the African-American performers like Louis Armstrong, because they fought in the war together in all the years that D.W.Griffith wasn't making movies. Because after the struggle, his life went on another 15 years. And John Ford's would go on another 30 years or 40 years. Hitchcock, starting in the sound era, would go on into the 60s and 70s. And so all these directors are getting far through the decades. The Cecil B. DeMille thing lasts until the 50s. And then we realized that they were all on the same path until Griffith got bumped off, and he got bumped off in 1930, mainly because it was too expensive for him to launch a sound film. Now, The Birth of a Nation and Intolerance still hadn't been paid for, and all these other movie tickets are in for what hadn't been paid for. And the reality of movie making, that you never really pay the movie off because you paid for it at the time, and it was all in loans or it was all in scrapbook organizing. And then you're using all the government pieces you can, which is really why the government edits it, because they own it, because they sent you a loan to make the film in a historical way. And so making it in a historical, every type of dividend you can get from a film, which is wider now with other markets than it was back then, but they had spent so much that they never recuperated the fee for Birth of a Nation. Maybe Intolerance, but that was as far as you could go with the money he had. But sometimes you think he had some more landslide films like Orphans of the Storm, and that's true, that he did have break-even and even landslide films that went on from a break-even. But to have one hanging over your head, you haven't all the way paid for, even in lawyer fees, to the situational ethics that sued you for the film of even saying The Klansman was a good thing, could go on in a sort of venture of D.W.Griffith praise. We praise him for his filmmaking only. We pay no attention to the fact, other than multicultural studies, that he totally miffed up the story of the Civil War and forgot that the North won, and perhaps the literature that he had expanded upon was from his dad being a soldier of the North. And that's how they got the literature of his wanting the South. I mean, his dad being from the South, Griffith's dad being from the South, had made him want to stage and set the war in the South like it happened in the Civil War. And I'm not saying there weren't Klansmen at the end of it. Do you have to show everything that's realistic in a film? Or was it only Birth of a Nation that could show the realism of the Klan? And that I wonder if we're all going to take on an anti-racist stance just because the Klan is in this film, and we're seeing it now as they're the good guys in the film, and that's why we've all got to join it. What's against it isn't really an anti-Griffith procedure, it's an anti-birth procedure. But if you still see it as maybe director African-American Oscar Micheaux saw it, he said it was the first presentation of race and its diminishment in history as to how we always see things in history, the diminishment of race. But he also said it was quite a collection of old stories from the South that many of his African-American friends had seen a similar backdrop to the South in their own memories, which could be tragic. It could be, I wish they could see the films nowadays about, like Django Unchained, about the Civil War, and these slaves that escape, like Nat Turner, and blow the whole plantation up for their girlfriend, like Nat Turner. And, you know, it doesn't even have to go to the Underground Railroad lengths of showing us how our films now are more politically grounded in what the history of the history really is, except for the revisionist history, which is to say it went a different way than it did, but not necessarily in an unethical way of us thinking about it. So we never get the what if the Klan was actually right, but we're still not totally drawing them out as things we need to get rid of in society just because they are kind of the Southern cliche of how to police the neighborhoods since the Civil War, and everybody's been wandering the streets lost and are about to start a riot. And then there's the Klan. Only we call that the police. No, the police aren't the Klan. I'm not saying that. Boo, boo, boo. But I'm just saying, like, I've got to end this, and we've gone over time, but if the racism of the film was promoting the Klan, Griffith didn't see that as a racist thing. He just saw it as an actual thing that put the South back together and is still in the South. And now they've gone secretive again, because by 1930, when he was going to release the sound version of Birth that they were working on making, it would have brought the Klan from underground. Griffith and Walter Houston weren't too afraid of that. They said it was kind of cool that that was happening. And yet they'd made movies that were trying to be on the dime of Babylon being a society for real, that we need to look at that race and say Babylon's a real race. But Griffith looked around politically even at the Broken Blossoms message of the Japanese being a hero. And you can see that D.W. Griffith is an eccentric director with a controversial nature. And in his case, challenges and contradicts the messages he's already made in his films, whether they be the shorts or all the way to the remake of Stars of Satan, the feature films. They all represent this kind of directing for the sake of directing. That's why they're contradictory thematically. And to be a contradictory thematically director is to go from a war movie to melodrama, like True Heart Susie. And a war movie to melodrama is kind of a big shift. So, of course, the representation of everything in the film that's going to be standard mode of representation since Birth of a Nation, Judith of Bethulia, Avenging Conscience, is this idea that dramatic interpretation will be universal in the message it portrays decade by decade, but that this overlaps that some of its history that will have to be reorganized means that a lot of it becomes a thematic contradiction that we don't see in most directors who choose a side. Griffith totally goes Yojimbo on all of us and goes politic to politics, side to side, guilt to guilt, blame to blame, north to south. That was a really good masterclass. Everybody, thank you for joining me. Sorry about the breaks in the middle where I had to take a painkiller for my back, and my back's kind of busted up. But we'll get into more of that in the off classes when we're talking about me and how I make films while we wait for the Tarantino course to come. Thank you all for coming to Masterclass. Thank you.